When humanity first found the lattice, they thought they had discovered the proof that the universe wanted company. For almost 4 centuries, they had crossed the dark alone. They had done it the hard way, with patient fusion drives, frozen crews, generation arcs, laser-pushed sails, and stubborn mathematics. They had tunneled through the cold outer margin of the Milky Way, from one thin scattering of stars to the next, carrying soil, languages, archives, and unborn cities in hulls that groaned against time. Every world they settled had been earned. Every atmosphere had been made breathable molecule by molecule. Every shipyard had been assembled in vacuum by human hands, or by machines built by human hands. There had been no ancient benefactors, no ruins waiting with gifts, no guiding beacons. Only distance and the refusal to be defeated by it. So when a survey flotilla in the Perseus Reach found a dormant transit spindle hanging beyond a dim red star, bigger than any structure humanity had ever built and older than any human institution still standing, the discovery hit with the force of revelation. The spindle was not a ruin, it was infrastructure. It listened, it answered. And when the right questions were asked in enough mathematical languages, it pointed inward, toward the crowded body of the galaxy. Then came the voices. Not one species, but thousands. Not one realm, but a civilization spread through tens of thousands of systems, layered with treaties, arbitration circles, convoy law, energy compacts, border regimes, migration accords, and transit authorities so old their founding records had become liturgy. Humanity had imagined, if they ever met others, a handful of peer civilizations. Instead, they found a living ecology of peoples. Translucent reef minds grown in methane pressure seas. Tall, six-limbed grazers whose memories were partly chemical and partly song. Clustered intelligences that inhabited swarms of shell bodies and spoke as a shifting quorum. Dense, radial beings from heavy-gravity oceans, who traveled in tanks and thought in recursive tides. There were traders and pilgrim species, archive species, client species, remnant species. There were ecologies of law and prestige, as complex as any biosphere. And above all of it, though no one said so at first, there were the elder powers. They were not emperors in any formal sense. The galaxy had no throne and no single banner. But 5 elder species, each ancient beyond human history, controlled the arteries that made civilization function. They held the high-throughput transit gates linking major trade corridors. They certified military drive geometries and reactor tolerances under the language of mutual safety. They owned or supervised most stellar-scale energy relays. They adjudicated territorial claims in contested regions. Their fleets set the standards everyone else's fleets were measured against. Their archives defined what levels of weapon, automation, and strategic mobility were acceptable for developing polities. They rarely gave orders bluntly. They did not need to, they were the climate. Humanity arrived dazzled by it. Their first envoys spoke with sincere reverence. Their first merchants signed agreements eagerly. Their first engineers accepted access restrictions with good humor because they understood caution, and because they truly believed they were being welcomed into something noble, an old, complicated peace that had, despite all odds, prevented the galaxy from burning itself to ash. They learned quickly. Human mathematicians adapted to transit geometry with indecent speed. Human linguists built bridges between species, whose cognition had seemed almost untranslatable. Human crews took to long-haul interstellar trade with the same stoic professionalism that had carried their ancestors across the outer dark. Human firms repaired neglected infrastructure in marginal systems because they were accustomed to making difficult things work far from support. Human agricultural ecologists transformed harsh colony worlds into productive environments faster than many older polities thought possible. Human volunteers served on anti-piracy patrols. Human mediators sat in local disputes and earned trust by being blunt, patient, and unexpectedly fair. For a little while, it seemed they had found what they had hoped for, not just neighbors, but history to join. The first insult was small enough that many humans tried to laugh it off. A relay chain on the Hecate corridor had been decaying for centuries, neglected because the route served little prestige traffic. Human engineers rebuilt 3 nodes, redesigned the cooling lattices, and increased throughput by nearly 40%. Traffic that had once taken months of queuing began to pass in days. Freight surged. Peripheral settlements prospered. Then, once the corridor mattered again, the Transit Harmonization Board reclassified the route as strategically sensitive and reassigned management to a favored client combined under the patronage of one of the elder species. Human operators were thanked publicly, praised in ceremonious language, and informed that non-certified polities could not retain supervisory control over major arterial infrastructure. The legal justification was impeccable. The result was simple. Humanity had revived a road they were no longer permitted to direct, price, or defend. There was anger at home, but still more disappointment than rage. The diplomats advised patience. Human entry into the wider order was new. Every civilization, they said, had old procedures and hidden rigidities. Better to prove reliability than to flare up over one confiscation dressed as regulation. So humanity endured. Then came Vale. Vale was a yellow-white star near the outer trade bands, with 3 barren inner worlds and 1 broad, airless super-Earth rich in volatiles and metals. It had no indigenous biosphere, no ancient claimant, no strategic relay. For 30 years humanity surveyed it, built orbital industry, seeded spin habitats, and began the long work of importing ice and atmosphere to the 4th moon of the super-Earth, planning a major colony complex there. They did everything by procedure. Claims were filed, renewed, defended in arbitration, and provisionally recognized. Then a senior territorial chamber reviewed old migratory maps from a client species called the Ithish, whose ribbon-bodied communities drifted in vast generation caravans and required unusual magnetosphere conditions for reproduction. An elder patron argued that the Vale system, while unused for ages, fit ancestral Ithish vector rights under a doctrine so obscure most human lawyers had never seen it cited. The chamber voided the human developmental claim. Compensation was offered for movable infrastructure. Permanent settlement was prohibited. Human families preparing to emigrate to Vale watched the star vanish from their maps, because an old species wanted to reward a dependent one in a way that cost the elder patron nothing. The human negotiators protested, then argued, then begged for a joint arrangement. They got sympathy in private and a rejection in public. Stability, they were told, required respect for precedent. The Ithish themselves sent a quiet transmission weeks later, routed through 3 intermediaries to hide its source. They apologized. They had not requested Vale. Refusing the grant would have been interpreted as ingratitude. 2 of their own planned expansions had been curtailed in prior generations by the same patronage system. They warned humanity gently not to assume that law meant fairness. That message spread in sealed channels through human institutions like a hairline crack widening in glass. After that, the pattern became impossible not to see. Human escorts on a convoy through the Narrows were ordered to break formation and yield fuel reserves, so a senior elder delegation could maintain ceremonial schedule, while refugee barges from a radiation-swept moon drifted in holding orbits. The convoy obeyed, because the order came under emergency priority. 3 barges lost life support margin before tugs arrived. The dead were mostly human contract workers and fringe settlers. In the inquiry that followed, an elder adjudicator described the losses as regrettable but proportionate within transit hierarchy. At a border review in the Kel Arc, human petitions to fortify 3 vulnerable outer systems were denied because independent deep defense arrays might alter local confidence balances. Months later, those same systems were raided by freebooters operating from a protectorate, whose patron conveniently delayed punitive action. When human security forces pursued beyond the cordon, they were censured for unauthorized escalation. A human-designed compact warship, optimized for convoy defense, was classified above the armament threshold allowed for non-core powers because its distributed reactor architecture could, in theory, support weapons capacities humanity had not even installed. Production licenses were capped. Existing hulls had to be mothballed or exported under inspection. Humanity complied outwardly and moved the design teams inward, behind walls. Every incident had a reason. Every reason belonged to a structure older than human outrage. Every appeal was met with process, and every process ended in the same conclusion. Humanity could participate, contribute, serve, and profit within bounds, but not decide the bounds. As decades passed, younger species began to talk to them in the pauses between formalities, not openly. Never in halls where records were kept forever, but in maintenance docks, freight lounges, agricultural exchanges, and waiting berths outside arbitration chambers, patterns emerged. The shell-swarm Marathi admitted they had once built a fast response fleet and been forced to dismantle it after safety review identified destabilizing potential. A methane-breathing scholar from the Ool Commonwealth explained that their people's access to stellar lifting had been restricted for 6 generations because surplus energy changed bargaining power. A choral envoy from the Terk fold, whose individuals lived only 9 years and stored continuity in communal memory halls, said with bleak precision that the elder species did not oppress from cruelty. They constrained because they believed hierarchy was civilization. Anything else looked to them like prelude to chaos. That somehow made it worse. Humanity had expected monsters if there was to be tyranny. Instead, they found curators, patient wardens. Powers who truly believed that younger species should not be permitted the tools to alter galactic equilibrium until they had matured for millennia under supervision. Human achievements were admired, but also filed under risk. Human adaptability was praised, but privately discussed as volatility. Their frontier habits, their independent colonies, their distributed command structures, and their talent for making do without central support all read to the elder gaze as dangerous signs. Humanity was to be welcomed, integrated, and quietly fenced in. By then the fencing had begun to produce a second, hidden history. Outwardly, humanity remained cooperative. They filed compliance statements. They accepted inspections. They continued trade. They spoke the language of shared order, mutual restraint, and lawful process. Their diplomats became known for calm, even when insulted. Their merchants endured petty humiliations with teeth-clenched professionalism. Their engineers smiled and handed over revised schematics stripped of the layers that mattered. Inwardly, every denial became data. Human physicists asked why military drive certification limited certain field transitions and discovered that the official thresholds were not physical limits at all, but administrative simplifications built around elder-era safety assumptions. Human systems theorists mapped transit dependence and concluded that the Great Lattice was less a seamless network than a set of choke points, whose control had been naturalized by age. Human material scientists studying sanctioned reactor shells found pathways to density's core standards considered impractical because elder manufacturing traditions had evolved around old abundance rather than frontier scarcity. Human logisticians compared convoy law, relay ownership, and fuel distribution, and realized that galactic power rested not only in fleets, but in the expectation that every fleet needed the same roads, the same depots, the same approved geometries. And because humanity had reached the stars before finding anyone else, they knew how to build without permission. The work went underground in plain sight. Restricted warship programs became industrial resilience platforms. Deep storage caverns on bleak moons became archival cryovaults. A new generation of civilian survey ships launched for outer resource assessment and did not publish full routes. Asteroid habitats in forgotten systems expanded their machine shops under agricultural grants. Fusion plants in remote colonies overproduced and buried the surplus in superconducting zinc fields. Universities split research teams across dozens of worlds, so no single audit showed the full design. Merchant houses accepted humiliating shipping constraints, while quietly mapping every place the old network failed to see. No grand proclamation announced it. There was no single conspiracy, because there did not need to be. The understanding spread through councils, ministries, guilds, cooperatives, military circles, and colonies with increasing clarity. If humanity remained inside the elder architecture, it would forever live by permission. If it meant someday to stand free, it would need roads no one could close, fleets no one had certified, industry no one had indexed, and command systems that could survive being cut off from the core. Still they waited. For many years restraint held because peace, though unjust, was still peace. Human leaders were not eager for war. They had seen enough dead in their own expansion history to know what interstellar violence would mean. And there remained a stubborn hope that the wider civilization might bend before it broke. After all, if hierarchy had been built over ages, perhaps it could be loosened by law, coalition, and patient pressure. Then came the Dasra incident, and patience curdled into something colder. Dasra was a mining and research habitat cluster around a brown dwarf near the border of human-settled space. It was poor, remote, and scientifically valuable mainly because its deep cryogenic wells hosted long baseline instruments used by several species. Human firms had developed the habitats. Human crews ran most of the extraction and maintenance. A relay malfunction in a neighboring region triggered a cascade of transit delays, and the elder-managed emergency board rerouted power support and rescue tugs away from Dasra in order to preserve throughput on a ceremonial spine serving two core worlds during a conjunction festival. The board's own projections showed Dasra's margin would collapse in 31 hours. Human administrators offered to dispatch unauthorized jump tenders and local reserve craft. Permission was denied because unsanctioned transit in an active emergency corridor would compound systemic instability. Dasra froze by increments. Rotational habitats lost thermal regulation. Dock sections failed seal integrity. A cluster carrying nearly 20,000 workers and family members vented atmosphere into the dark. By the time authorized assistance arrived, more than 11,000 people were dead, including almost every child in the educational rings. The inquiry was efficient, bloodless, and unbearable. The board had followed prioritization doctrine. Core corridor continuity affected more aggregate commerce. Unauthorized intervention might have disrupted wider safety management. The losses, again, were regrettable. One elder representative, a member of an ancient species whose body resembled a crown of polished black limbs around a suspended sensory core, said during a closed hearing that frontier populations accepted elevated exposure as the price of expansion. The statement leaked. Across human space, grief became hatred with a legal citation attached. Even then, humanity did not strike. They built memorials, They compensated survivors. They accelerated every hidden program. And they made one final attempt to avoid the future, now visible to almost everyone. The proposal came 53 years after first contact, drafted in language so restrained it was almost austere. Humanity requested formal recognition as an autonomous, non-integrated civilization at the galactic periphery. It did not ask for war reparations, border revisions, or retaliation rights. It offered continued peaceful trade, open scientific exchange, reciprocal passage guarantees, and arbitration of legacy disputes through neutral panels. It agreed to mutual non-aggression monitoring and pledged not to interfere in the internal arrangements of any other polity. It asked only that human-settled space be removed from elder regulatory authority, that human-built transit and defense infrastructure no longer require external certification, and that no future territorial reassignment be imposed without direct bilateral consent. It was, in effect, a lawful secession from dependency. The debate in the central chambers lasted 9 days. Many younger species watched with a kind of secret, terrified longing. Some hoped the request might be granted, proving that the order could adapt. Others feared exactly the opposite, because they understood too well what happened to those who tried to leave. The answer came in layered language, grave and paternal. The elder bloc rejected the request. No member polity, it said, could unilaterally exempt itself from the obligations that preserved galactic stability. Frontier autonomy on the scale proposed would create unsafe precedent, encourage military opacity, threaten transit confidence, and invite fragmentation. Humanity was instructed to return to compliance review, accept expanded inspection protocols, and suspend all unapproved strategic construction pending audit. Humanity replied with one final note. It reaffirmed peaceful intent. It stated that inspection teams would not be admitted. It requested negotiations on practical disengagement. It warned, with painful politeness, that coercive enforcement inside human space would be regarded as an unlawful act. The old powers read that warning the way they had read every human protest before it, as overreach from an energetic but containable younger civilization. So they chose an example. The target was not a fortress. It was not even a major colony. It was a small world called Ankar's Lantern, orbiting a pale star at the edge of the human settlement web. The planet had thin air, domed towns, algae reservoirs, wind farms on basalt ridges, and a population just under 200,000, most of them terraform technicians, miners, and their families. It had no significant fleet presence. It did, however, host an unlicensed mass driver array designed to launch construction material to outer orbit without using approved transit freight. In elder legal theory, that made it strategic infrastructure. 3 enforcement fleets arrived without declaration, broadcasting citations from the Stability Accords. Local authorities were ordered to surrender the orbital array, shut down the planetary grid, and accept occupation inspectors. The governor answered that the colony was civilian, that the array was industrial, and that negotiations were ongoing at higher level. She asked for delay. She requested neutral observers. She pleaded for time to evacuate the vulnerable domes if force was intended. The admiral in command refused. To hesitate, he transmitted, would signal weakness across the periphery. The bombardment was limited by the standards of empires and monstrous, by any standard that mattered. Orbital strikes shattered the power spine, linking Lantern's dome-chain settlements. Atmospheric processors failed in sequence. 2 domes ruptured immediately. A third collapsed when emergency shutters lost current in a dust storm. The algae sea in the southern basin boiled under a kinetic impact, that was never meant to hit civilians, but had been targeted to disable thermal reserves nearby. Rescue craft trying to lift from the Capitol Plateau were vaporized by point defense screens that classified all launches as potential resistance. The fleets did not glass the planet, they did something colder. They crippled life support and watched a marginal world die by systems failure because that was lawful proportional enforcement against non-compliant infrastructure. By the time the bombardment ceased, over 90,000 people were dead. The admiral issued a formal statement expressing sorrow for unintended casualties and affirming that decisive action had prevented wider instability. For 16 hours, the galaxy waited for the human response. None came. At first, the silence looked like shock. Then it deepened into something else. Human traders failed to arrive in ports where they had docked on exact schedules for decades. Human embassy channels acknowledged receipt of messages and nothing more. Human delegates left arbitration compounds between 1 hour and the next, taking archives, private servers, and personal effects with them. Human freight convoys, already underway, diverted and vanished beyond registered lanes. Human students departed foreign academies. Human contractors walked off relay stations and fuel depots. Human crews in mixed-species patrols transferred command, sealed lockers, and boarded shuttles without argument. Across thousands of systems, personnel counted on for maintenance, logistics, medicine, accounting, and translation simply withdrew. The withdrawal was so complete, so synchronized, that many who witnessed it felt the first true stab of fear then, before a single shot was fired. Traffic analysts watched human transponder signatures collapse across the network like lights going out on a map. Financial clearinghouses found no fraud, no panic selling, no broken chains of command. There was just absence, as if an entire civilization had inhaled and not yet breathed out. The elder bloc announced sanctions, mobilization reviews, emergency convoy substitutions. They expected hasty retaliation somewhere on the frontier, an outburst of rage they could contain and punish. Their fleets moved to secure relay hubs near human space. Their inspectors prepared seizure orders. Their strategists modeled a conventional campaign against dependent worlds using dependent infrastructure. Then the first enforcement fleet at Ankar's Lantern disappeared, not damaged, not forced to retreat. Disappeared from all external telemetry for 11 seconds, and when it returned to sensor view, it was already dead. Hulls drifted in molten sections. Drive rings had been cut apart with impossible precision. Reactor cores sat cold in vacuum, their containment fields inverted and frozen into harmless glass. Boarding records recovered later suggested that command crews had not even understood they were under attack until their tactical systems failed all at once. 2 more fleets moved to intercept whatever had done it. They never reached engagement range. Their transit exits collapsed around them, not by sabotage of the lattice, but by local field conditions no elder doctrine predicted. Ships emerged blind, without synchronized targeting, and found no enemy where enemy vessels should have been. They found only weapon effects arriving from angles their own navies had long ago declared non-viable. The revelation spread in fragments. Human ships were not using approved drive geometries. Human ships were not dependent on major lattice spindles. Human ships were crossing distances and maneuvering in gravity conditions core standards classified as prohibitive. Human ships were carrying reactors far denser than sanctioned military tolerances allowed. Human command nets could function through interference that blanked everyone else. And worst of all for the elder powers, the human systems had not appeared overnight. The scale of the offensive made that obvious. Hidden depots opened in dead systems and asteroid shadows. Reserve squadrons rose from beneath regolith, from inside comets, from black shipyards folded into the glare of ordinary industrial zones. Peripheral colonies once dismissed as too sparse to matter became launch points, repair yards, and logistics hubs. Human commerce, long mocked as over-distributed and inefficient, turned out to have been the skeleton of a war architecture no one had seen because everyone assumed a younger species would naturally converge on approved centralization. Humanity did not answer Lantern with indiscriminate fury. That was what made the retaliation terrifying. They hit instruments, not populations. Relay citadels used to enforce corridor compliance were disabled in hours. Certification fortresses where military standards had been imposed on half the galaxy were boarded, archives copied, and reactors shut down. Orbital foundries dedicated to producing sanctioned fleet components for the Elder Bloc were rendered inert with surgical strikes that left worker habitats untouched. 3 great transit choke points, each considered too vital to be seriously threatened, were captured intact by assault forces that appeared on both sides of the defensive perimeter at once. Human cybernetic warfare, developed in the shadows of a bureaucracy that had underestimated software not born in its own traditions, turned command cohesion into a rumor. Fleets entering battle under Elder Doctrine found their logistics desynchronized, munitions tagged, and trusted sensor standards feeding them elegant lies. At the Battle of Red Meridian, an Elder Armada nearly 600 capital hulls strong formed for a decisive engagement under the belief that sheer mass and ancient experience would crush any upstart advantage. Human forces met them with fewer visible ships than expected, then unfolded a second and third line from beneath thermal cloaks anchored to debris fields the Armada had already scanned and dismissed. The first Elder volley crossed empty coordinates. The human return cut drive section from flagships before shields oriented. Within 20 minutes, the Armada's command structure had broken into isolated local fights. Within 2 hours, it no longer existed as a coherent fleet. At the Harrow Spindle, where generations of lesser polities had queued for transit rights and paid tribute in time, fuel, and obedience, human marines secured the station core and broadcast every hidden throughput ledger, every discriminatory access algorithm, every emergency prioritization rule that had consigned marginal populations to die so. Core schedules would hold. The galaxy listened in horror as the architecture of stability became legible. The Elder Bloc called for general mobilization. They invoked treaties, shared danger, civilizational continuity. They warned every younger species that if the human revolt succeeded, chaos would consume the stars. And for the first time in ages, fear failed to produce obedience. Some species remained loyal from conviction or dependence or terror of what came next, but many more stalled. Convoys did not arrive. Auxiliaries developed maintenance delays. Sensor nets suffered unexplained outages. Border commands requested clarification until deadlines passed. Worlds that had bowed for centuries discovered, in the narrow space opened by human violence, that they could say no. The Ithish refused transit access to an Elder Strike group and publicly cited ancestral vector rights. The Marathi shell swarms, whose fleet had once been dismantled, reactivated hidden defense clusters and announced neutrality. The Terk Fold opened memory archives documenting generations of coercion and sent them to every public channel they could reach before censorship collapsed. Across the middle strata of the galaxy, species long trained to survive by caution made the calculation all at once that the old powers might actually lose, and that helping them now would only preserve the chains. The final confrontation came not at a throne world, because there was none, but in the clustered systems around the oldest energy nexus in known space. There the Elder Bloc had anchored its remaining strategic reserves, its archive cores, and the command lattice through which it still hoped to coordinate loyal fleets. The Nexus was defended by weapons platforms older than human civilization, and by commanders who had spent centuries believing that no crisis, however severe, could truly overthrow the order they embodied. Humanity came through routes the defenders did not know existed. The battle lasted less than a day. Human strike groups sliced the outer bastions apart, bypassed killing zones by vector shifts Elder simulation had long deemed impossible, and severed power-sharing links that made the ancient platforms dangerous. Boarding actions took archive towers before purge commands could fire. Reserve fleets attempting to form around the Nexus found their transit exits folded into lethal geometry by field engines built from principles humanity had learned by studying what the Elders themselves had forbidden anyone to ask too many questions about. When it was over, the Elder powers still existed. Their homeworlds were untouched. Their people remained alive. Their libraries were not burned. Their species were not exterminated or enslaved. But the machinery by which they had ruled everyone else was broken beyond immediate repair. The choke points were gone. The certification monopolies were gone. The legal supremacy attached to strategic infrastructure had vanished because the infrastructure itself was no longer theirs to ration. Their fleets, once the quiet argument behind every consensus, had been shattered in battle after battle by a civilization they had considered bright, useful, emotional, and containable. Only then did humanity speak at length. The address was carried on seized relays, local comm nets, and emergency bands in 1,000 translations. It began with Ankar's lantern and named the dead. It named Dasra. It named Vale. It named the convoy barges abandoned in the Narrows. It named dozens of smaller humiliations and restrictions not because any one of them justified war alone, but because together they described a system that had turned subordination into peace and called that morality. Then the message changed. Humanity did not claim dominion. It did not announce a new order under human management. It did not demand tribute, protectorates, or civilizational leadership. It declared instead that no species would henceforth hold exclusive authority over transit standards, territorial arbitration, strategic energy, or military development for others. The captured archives would be opened. The technical ceilings imposed by Elder decree would be published. Relay and gate governance would be distributed through rotating multilateral compacts. Worlds and polities wishing to remain under old patronage could do so temporarily, but no one would be compelled. Human forces would continue military operations only against fleets and facilities, attempting to restore coercive hierarchy by force. There were those who did not believe them at first. History had trained the galaxy to hear victory as the prelude to domination. But then the proof arrived in deeds. Human occupation forces withdrew from surrendered core systems after disarming military assets and transferring transit administration to provisional councils that included local populations and neighboring polities. Human engineers restored services to worlds that had fought against them. Archive caches containing suppressed energy and propulsion research were released to broad scientific federations rather than hoarded. At Vale, humanity did not reclaim the system by fiat. It invited the Ithish and neutral mediators to negotiate a shared development charter. At Ankar's lantern, whose dead could not be restored, the ruins were preserved under a sky once again lit by repaired orbital mirrors, and delegations from dozens of species came to stand in silence where the domes had broken. In the years that followed, the galaxy did not become gentle. Old fears remained. Local wars flared where Patrona collapsed faster than institutions could replace it. Some elder worlds turned inward in bitterness. Some younger ones overreached with weapons they barely understood. Freedom did not solve the ancient problem of living together at scale among minds that had evolved under different stars. But the climate had changed. A species from the fringe, born alone in the dark and taught by hardship to build what it lacked, had endured insult after insult because it still believed belonging might be possible. When it learned that belonging meant permanent obedience, it had not lashed out blindly. It had watched, learned, prepared, and asked one last time to part in peace. Only when that request was answered with exemplary murder had it drawn back into silence, and from that silence emerged a power the galaxy had never imagined it possessed. Not a new empire. Something far stranger, and in the end far more dangerous to tyrants. A civilization that remembered what it was to have no roads but the ones it made for itself, and that, having broken the oldest chains in the stars, refused to forge them anew.